was the man who coined the acronym BRIC. And now I'm sure somewhere Neill, when he looks back and talks about the acronym BRIC, he takes a lot of pride in the fact that he was able to predict China's rise and India's rise really decades ahead of what the world saw it. Neill, what a pleasure to have you on ET Now. Thank you for joining us.
It's my great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Jim, the year 2022 has been a year of twists and turns and peak and troughs. Whatever could go wrong perhaps has gone wrong. A war, a scary inflation print, stubborn interest rate increase by central bankers. But we are about to unwind the year not on a note of extreme fear. There is a little bit of hesitation, but there is a lot of relief also that, hey, 2022 is finally over.
Yes, I have to say, it's a year that is very nice to be nearly over. It has been such a complicated year on a very personal basis for my family. One of our children, our son, got married, so that part of it was pleasant. But I can't remember much else, and certainly in terms of the world economy and world society, that has meant that this is a year, anything other than one that we want to finish as soon as possible. And hopefully some of the clouds might start to lift, as you imply with your question.
Are we in for another tricky year ahead? Do you think 2023 will be equally challenging to call?
I don't know. I'm trying to keep an open mind. One thing, as I learn as my years go by, and I'm not in the professional forecasting business every minute of every day, is I try to keep an open mind. But I would also add, there are some things, particularly aspects of the inflation issue, that I think the evidence is starting to become more positive. But against that, there are so many huge unknowns, including things that could make inflation worse again. And actually, the last thing to mention on, maybe we'll get into it more, on the day we're having this discussion, the Bank of Japan has just announced a quite potentially important change in its monetary policy stance. If the BOJ is going to start exiting QE, then there's going to be a whole new set of negative consequences for world bond markets, which could have a knock-on effect to equity markets, which both could then have a knock-on effect to economic events too. So there is definitely lots of issues out there. One has to think about how we navigate carefully.
So Jim, one side markets are happy and breathing a sigh of relief that worst of the inflation is behind us. But it's also the transition where you get worried that have central bankers really, in their entire effort to bring inflation down, have they stormed the growth? And could it be the R word, recession, which would be the dominating fear for 2023?
I mean, I think it is now, as we turn the year. I can't really recall a period in my 40 years of looking at world economics and finance where I can remember so many people are confidently forecasting recessions across the Western world, the only debate being how severe. And that is quite interesting, because if inflation turns out to be improving a lot faster, as one very famous US hedge fund manager said to me many, many years ago, the only thing you know about central banks is when the evidence changes, they'll change the view. And in this past week, as you know, the Fed has talked in the US again, very tough about how long it'll keep rates higher for. And that's the message they want to send us now. But if it looks like inflation starts to improve a lot more, and if the economy weakens more, the Fed will change the view. So we'll wait and see, and it's going to be extremely interesting to watch.
Jim, how do you see China as an economy evolving and opening in 2023? It's anyone's guess. Some are calling it a black box, some are calling it a Pandora's box. Everyone is guessing. Frankly, no one knows right now.
I agree with that too. Given how long China has had this very rigid lockdown policy, and on the available evidence that we all can see about the rate of vaccination, there is obviously quite a lot of risks from this abrupt change. And you do get an enormous increase in COVID infection, and for the elderly, an increase in mortality. That said, as most other countries have experienced, the last variants of COVID, Omicron as it's known, of course, appears to be pretty mild. And it's not out of the bounds of possibility that the Chinese now significantly accelerate the vaccination rates. And they managed to get through. But this is obviously a huge unknown. And then because of what's happened with the tightening of policy, particularly in terms of the residential real estate market and credits, there's lots of uncertainties about that too. But if I put it all together and I look at the policies that the Chinese government have announced in the past week or so to try and support the consumer, I think by the spring, I would be in the camp that thinks that China might at least cyclically positively surprise next year.
Jim, let me point out for our viewers the India experience. The Indian economy went through a grinding lockdown for about 3 months, but when it opened up, there was a huge pent-up demand, revenge shopping. The attitude towards spending at a consumer level has changed. If China opens in 2023 at some point in time, and we are talking about over 1 billion people, could that lead to a very big differentiated demand-driven world in 2023? Demand for commodities, demand for oil, demand for energy, everything will start zooming up and it could be back to the inflationary fears?
I mean, that's an interesting risk of a stronger than expected China. And of course, it is possible. China, as I've discussed with you many a time, and as you mentioned in the introduction, has become an enormous marginal influence on the world economy in so many different markets. And if China improves, particularly if it's being driven by their own consumer, this is going to be a pretty positive thing for certainly a number of other economies, particularly consumer exporting ones in Asia, included in them probably Japan and South Korea, probably Germany and Europe. And so I'm really focused on that. But it is true that that with it could mean an increased Chinese demand for commodities, including energy. But that would really depend on what style of improved consumer activity the Chinese undertake. If it's more to do with even faster use of internet-based shopping and not necessarily a huge amount of more personal travel, then it might not have the consequences on commodities. And then, of course, if the real estate market remains under pressure, then that would limit some of the demand for certain commodities that relate to house building. So I wouldn't want to have too strong a view on that, but you would think at the margin, if China comes back stronger, certainly the big decline in commodity prices that's been taking place in recent months will come to an end. And that would be, of course, as a consequence, an additional reason why central banks would be very cautious.
Jim, I'll take the clock back and take it almost a decade back when you coined the acronym BRIC. And frankly, if you look at the progress of the BRIC nations which you coined, which to your mind has been the strongest BRIC economy and which to your mind will be the strongest BRIC economy for next 5 years?
Well, it's actually it's over 21 years now. November the 30th, 2001 is when I first brought the acronym into discussion. And so if I look back, it's very clear that China has easily become the most successful of them on relative and absolute terms, as I've touched on already. Today, it is twice the size of all the other BRIC countries put together. India has done pretty well as well, of course. It's not done quite as well as its potential over that period, but it's done well enough to become the 5th largest economy in the world. And of course, Brazil and Russia have been a huge disappointment, particularly in the second decade. When I look forward to the next 5 years, I think it's very hard for me to avoid the conclusion that India actually looks the most promising. What is really interesting since COVID that you touched on, India's come out of it seemingly reasonably well. And despite so many challenges to India's education and health system and many other issues, there are certain aspects of the Indian economy that superficially positively surprised me, particularly how it's coped with this period of huge energy increases and how it appears to be increasingly embracing new technologies to fight climate change. And if you put all these things together with the enormous positive dynamics of its labor force, I think in theory, the next 5 years look pretty good for India. And if I put it in the BRICS context, as this decade unfolds, India is in a position as we get towards the end of the decade, towards approaching being the 3rd largest economy in the world not long after. And so it's quite exciting for India. For China, there are enormous challenges that we've touched on, but I do think there's a decent chance they will do better the next 2 years than they have the past 2, which in a way won't be difficult. But I do worry that unless President Xi becomes more friendly to business and somehow we have an improvement between China and the rest of the world, China is probably past the absolute best time of its growth performance, and it might only grow by around 3 to 4% on average for this decade, which would mean India would almost definitely grow by more than China.
So heartening to hear that, Jim, and so heartening to hear that indeed. Jim, if I can be a devil's advocate, I would like to just flag up one concern, which is a very visible concern, that if Indian economy has to go from 3 trillion to 5 and 5 to 10, the energy needs of the country are going to be huge. They're going to be large. And as the per capita increases, your energy consumption will also increase in the same proportion. India is still energy dependent, whether it is gas or oil, and solar and alternatives are still a distance away. Do you think this could be the biggest impediment for India?
Potentially. I mean, again, I'm going to be in the spirit of how I've answered much of what you said earlier. You know, I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody does. What I would say as a constructive source of hope as we draw 2022 to a close, what is fascinating to me is if you look at what's happened with global activity and global energy usage and global gas prices, despite the scale of the damage and the ongoing war in Ukraine, European gas prices have fallen by over half. They did reach at their peak. And there is growing evidence that many European countries have rather rapidly improved their so-called, what we call energy efficiency, by essentially using less energy for the same amount of GDP growth. And it's something that sticks in my mind because if I go back over 40 years to when I did my PhD, I did it during the second oil price crisis. And what really emerged from that period is that energy consumption declined as a share of GDP and energy efficiency improved dramatically. And Japan at the time was a particularly strong positive example. And so and that's why I partly touched on earlier what appears to be growing evidence of big companies in India starting to be more active in trying to improve ways of energy efficiency and finding alternative energies. So it is obviously a huge concern that as India gets bigger and goes from 3 to 5 and 5 to 10 trillion, its carbon footprint gets bigger. But I would not dismiss the possibility that the opposite is the case, and this just ends up being this enormously exciting period for the application of more efficient and a whole new set of alternative energies in India.
I'm just going to shift gears and perhaps change the scope of the discussion, and I'll throw in one more ingredient in the melting pot. How do you see the geopolitical situation evolving? I'm not talking about the war, Jim, but I'm talking about the big blocks here, whether it is NATO or what is happening to the Quad bloc, G20. How do you see the big blocks now moving in 2023?
I mean, what I would just say at the outset about that is again, as this year finishes, it is fascinating to observe how India itself has navigated this very, very challenging and complex issue about geopolitical opposition or cooperation. In some ways, India is showing itself to be a bit of an exemplar as to how you navigate between these great big forces of China and the US, and it seems to have done it quite well. But these issues are not going to go away. But let me start by saying what could be a very long answer, and I'll try not to make it so. But how China deals with this probable pickup in COVID infection itself might be relevant to how the next stage of this challenging global cooperative spirit develops. I've said to some Chinese policymakers, and whether it ever gets back to the highest levels, I don't know, but what a really, really bold and clever thing for the Chinese to do would be actually to consider importing a large number of the best Western vaccines, which would send a very different message about how eager China was to truly cooperate on global trade, and would almost definitely force a more open-minded approach and a more positive response from Washington and probably European capitals. On the same kind of spirit, as I think I've said to you before, but I say it always to Chinese policymakers, for the next stage of One Belt, One Road, which is a signatory policy of President Xi, I would love to see the Chinese actively invite India to help co-design it, rather than what has been the approach since 2013, where China basically just tells the rest of the world how it's going to do it, because it's not working for them. And as we pass through time, it causes more countries to be a little bit resentful and not wanting to cooperate with this part of their policy. But if we had the improvements in trade and investment between China and many other Asian countries, India included, and I've looked at the numbers so many times in the past, the boost that would give to Asian trade and world trade would be absolutely spectacular. And we need some kind of new initiative and some new way of thinking to break this rather tiresome and frustrating and somewhat boring sort of never-ending standoff between the US and the G7 countries these days collectively, and China and many parts of the emerging world, because it's so clear, and this goes obviously all the way back to 21 years when I created the BRIC acronym. It's very clear we live in a world where there's important countries that don't share the same cultural or political beliefs. And we've just got to get on with it and find a way of cooperating for everybody's best interests, rather than to have some kind of battle as to which one's better, because that is not going to be a situation in which anybody wins.
Jim, so if you have to make a list of 2 or 3 individual personalities or politicians or business people whom we should watch out for apart from tracking your views on ETNA for 2023, who would be on that list?
I hope so. You know, I mean, linked to how I just answered the question, that we're going to have personalities that are leaders of important countries that can start to think more about what is in the best interests of 7 to 8 billion people around the world, or I think it's just gone over 8 billion, and not be so wrapped up in their domestic politics and this very modern, challenging interplay between 24/7 social media, where so many political leaders seem to essentially say what they think is going to look good on Twitter or sound good on Twitter and other forms of social media. We need to get away from that. And so I don't know which personalities, but we need more personalities to think what is truly right for the global systematic benefits.
Jim, I'm going to shift again and perhaps focus on the near term, which is your understanding of where do you think there are opportunities in the market where wealth can be created. So if you have to spot what could be called as a trade or perhaps an asset which is mispriced, how do you see 2023 evolving for macro investors, and what is that macro trade according to you?
So with the caveat that I'm obviously not in the business day to day, week to week in the way I was for over 30 years, let me try and answer you. I might be making a mistake because I'm not, but who knows? Maybe it's an advantage that I'm a bit more removed. But the obvious thing to me, again, focusing even more on it on the day that the Bank of Japan has made these changes, it seems to me quite clear that the US dollar is significantly overvalued. And you can see the reaction just against the yen. Before we started talking today, the dollar has dropped by over 3% against the yen today. And as we move into 2023, I would think a considerable further weakening of the dollar against the yen is, I'm scared to say highly likely because of the amount of time I've spent in the foreign exchange market. Nothing is highly likely, but I think that's as close to it as it gets. And with it, I think further dollar weakness that's just maybe started to happen against many other currencies is likely if the Fed shows more and more signs of reaching a peak of interest rates. And that could be true for many other developed currencies, but also for many currencies of the emerging world. Which, secondly, with it, if that's true, then I think it would increase the likelihood of a period of outperformance of non-US equities relative to US equities. And probably also even bigger, non-US dollar local government bonds than US dollar bonds. But we'll see. If I look how the dollar's performed as the Fed has moved from hiking by 75 to 50 and sending messages that it's perhaps near the peak, and the market trying to anticipate this period where inflation comes down faster and how the dollar's turned so easily, it seems to me, as we develop more of that, the dollar will probably fall by some considerable distance against many currencies.
Just to wrap it up with one final question, Jim, if you have to bet on a country index via the ETF route for next 5 years, which is that country you would invest and you would be overweight on?
Oh, goodness me, that's tough. You know, I'm gonna be really naughty and give you 3 places. I mean, the power of the Indian market seems to know no end. You know, on some criteria, it often seems relatively expensive given the scale of the rally that it's had. But of course, it might well be, because the market often knows better than all of us looking at it, that India's dynamics are becoming so special and positive that it just keeps going. And I don't dismiss that possibility. I do think if China shows a stronger cyclical recovery than people think, certainly the near-term part of the next 5 years, and we've seen some sign of that recently, the next 18 months or so, the Chinese market could recover sharply. And then if I was pushed to say a third, I'm going to be really patriotic and say perhaps the UK, because if you look at how the UK market is valued within developed markets, it is certainly very cheap. Now, it's cheap for good reasons because the UK has had so many problems, but it won't take much of a modest improvement for the UK to start to stand out as looking cheaper. So I'll say those three and let's see what happens.
Neill, what a pleasure to have you on ET Now. Thank you for patiently answering all our questions. You've really been generous and accommodative with all our interview requests for 2022. So big thank you for that on behalf of everyone from ET Now.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to speaking to you again in 2023.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.